So today I am joined in studio by Akin Sawyerr, the Africa lead of Decred, and also a longtime blockchain and Africa expert, two things that it seems like are converging very, very quickly. Akin, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So what is Decred's interest in Africa? And maybe we should start off by just talking a little bit about what Decred is.
Sure. So Decred is sort of loosely defined as a proof of work, proof of stake hybrid blockchain.
Okay.
It was, developed by a team that had built a second implementation of Bitcoin called BTC Suites on Golang. And, they decided after sort of experiencing the governance process in Bitcoin, there are some material issues in how it was structured, just in terms of a little bit of a lack of transparency on how decisions were made and sort of where power was centered. And so they decided to develop and build Decred to try to solve this problem around governance and ensuring that various stakeholder groups had some level of alignment to ensure that you had a sustainable way to build and evolve a blockchain over time.
Okay.
So as a result of that, they came up with this idea of a hybrid proof of work, proof of stake blockchain platform. And the idea there was that you would have, a system where miners, token holders, which are effectively folks that own Decred, and then the developers and folks who work on the network had some level of alignment and skin in the game, and then some clarity into how decisions were made. So the unique thing about Decred is with Bitcoin block rewards go solely to miners, but in Decred we have 3 pots in which block rewards are split. 60% go to miners, 30% go to what are called ticket holders, and so those are folks who have tokens but also stake their tokens, and then 10% goes into a treasury that effectively funds developers and folks that work on the platform.
Okay, and let's talk. So let's kind of break it down because this is kind of deep into blockchain. So what is a block reward?
So typically, with proof of work blockchains like Bitcoin, right, which is the first. Bitcoin is secured by miners who are effectively, trying to solve these complex math problems in order to record transactions. And in order to do that, you have to deploy, a lot of computing power to do that. And so there's a cost to that, right? There's a cost to sort of having the rigs, using electricity, and running these machines effectively, in competition with others to kind of fight for a block reward. And the block reward is basically the reward these miners get for recording transactions and securing the network. So the mere act of, contributing hash power, which is computing power, to record these transactions makes it really hard to effectively, curtail the network, right? So you need computing power to have the right to store transactions, and that forms a layer of security, basically, blockchain space.
Okay. And so why did you originally get into blockchain? Because, you, I think, are unique in that you came to it from the Africa side, right? You were already working in the Africa space and the development space before blockchain was even a thing, and then you discovered it from that context, right?
Yep. So, I grew up in Nigeria through secondary school, and then, spent all my college, grad school, my working career here in the U.S. And about 8 years ago, I had the opportunity to invest in a mobile payments company in Sierra Leone that's run by a friend of mine who's from Ghana. But he moved out of Sierra Leone to run this company. And he did a friends and family round at the time, and I put some money in, and I got me a seat on the board. And I did that because I was at a point in my career where I was really thinking a little bit about Africa. Back then I was in management consulting, I was trying to do a little bit more in Africa. I wasn't quite sure what that was, but this presented an opportunity. And I thought mobile payments were really interesting because it was at the junction of mobile penetration just scaling across Africa, and this idea that the future of financial services is going to be on mobile platforms. At least my thought was that if you're going to get the majority of Africa in a formal financial system, it was going to be on mobile platforms. And so that was my general thesis around this idea of, all right, mobile payments sound interesting. At the time, M-Pesa was already taking off. So there was an example in the marketplace. And then you had a number of mobile payments companies begin to prop up in other parts of Africa. So that's how I got into the fintech payment space. And along the way, a couple years into it, we realized relatively clearly that the remittance space was really large, right? So Sierra Leone had been a post-conflict country, and a lot of the GDP was coming from outside the country, right? From the diaspora, from NGOs, from U.S. government, USAID, right? And so we realized very quickly that remittance space really was a large contributor of GDP across sub-Saharan Africa. And we also realized that it was a really big problem in terms of the cost of moving value into Africa. And so that was so think about it, large, captive market, so to speak, of value coming in, but very inefficient for a number of reasons. And so I started spending some time just thinking about how does one really solve this issue? Like, what are the issues? What are the real problems around why remittances were expensive? And a lot of it was tied to regulation and just very, very strong incumbents, that were effectively gatekeepers, the banks and a couple of remittance companies. And at the same time, Bitcoin had been around for quite a while, but hadn't sort of gotten the level of awareness that we have now. And I just started doing some research into it, and then happened upon blockchain. What is blockchain? The protocol level, and just thought this really was the future of financial services, and this could be one way to solve this issue of expensive remittances.
Right. And so is Splash the mobile payments company in Sierra Leone? Are they doing anything with blockchain? Are they looking at it at all?
No. So Splash is a traditional mobile payments company. It's based heavily on an agent network, so which are effectively like branches, but it could be a convenience store, it could be a guy on the street, and that became they basically are the bridge for the populace to get access to banking services.
Yeah. So
Splash itself is not built on a blockchain platform, but I think the way I think about it is you sort of go after value, and so if you look at the amount of money that comes into sub-Saharan Africa annually, Nigeria alone is, depending on what statistic you believe, I think it's between $40 and $60 billion going into the country annually, and about 10% of that is absorbed in fees.
Wow.
So if you're estimating that to be $4 to $6 billion in fees, then if you can kind of, go from 10% to, 1%, there's a lot of value you can kind of save and capture. So, my thinking is, you'll have, that's kind of the roundabout way I think you get to, in my view, just proliferation of digital financial services, right? If you solve the remittance problem and put more money in the hands of people and get them onto these digital platforms, then you can build other financial products on top of it. And if you do that leveraging blockchain, you have very little friction in terms of, just transfer costs and transactions costs. Then you can create these new products that are more accessible to Africans from a cost perspective.
Yeah.
And these products can be sourced anywhere, right? Because you now have a protocol where you can move money globally, with very little friction and very little cost. So you can effectively fund financial products anywhere in the world and sell into African markets.
So do you think that any of these mobile money or mobile operators in Africa, obviously MTN being one of the largest, do you think that they're going to do any sort of pivot towards the direction of blockchain, or do you think that there's an element of like a innovator's dilemma where it's like they've spent all this all these resources building the pipes and building the distributions, and it would just kind of disrupt the infrastructure that they've already have in place.
No, so I mean, I kind of think about, the telcos or those who sort of have pipes on the ground as, key parts of infrastructure, right? So if you look at what's going on in telecom across most of Africa, over the years, there's been, like most markets, right, a compression of cost, right? So voice services are relatively inexpensive. Texting is relatively inexpensive. I think access to broadband is still limited because that's still expensive. But I think over time, the cost of that will go down, right? So the telcos basically are providing this service of aggregating the local markets, getting them onto, mobile platforms. And, now MTN, for example, has MTN money in a number of countries, which is basically a mobile money. And they just recently got a license in Nigeria. So I think that for most of those big local players, there's still a lot of the market for them to sort of go after and aggregate, even with just, regular tech, off-the-shelf technology. But I think over time, what will happen is you'll have blockchain-based protocols that are integrating with these folks, saying, all right, you have a marketplace, you have a network. How do we bring more value to that network? And I think, telcos inherently and large players eventually don't become the points of innovation, right? Others innovate and find ways to now access the markets or their user base and figure out a way to split the value.
Yeah.
So I think that's basically what I think is going to happen.
So is MTN Money basically their equivalent of like M-Pesa to Safaricom?
Effectively, exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Interesting. And so that's active in all their markets, or just the ones where they got the
I know
license?
It's a handful of markets. I mean, some markets are more liberal than others, right? So I believe MTN Money is in Ghana, for example. But for years in Nigeria, they've been, Nigerian law basically has prohibited telcos from getting into financial services.
Right.
But I think those rules are now being relaxed.
Yeah.
And I think the initial resistance was because, frankly, the banks were powerful incumbents and resisted that.
Yeah.
So, and I think that stifled the growth of mobile money in Nigeria, for example, relative to places like Kenya, Tanzania, where, it's been telco-led. And so from a customer standpoint, it makes sense, right, for the telcos to have access. But, and so mobile money has not, in countries where there's been that like division, mobile money has had less of an opportunity to kind of proliferate.
Right.
And I think now some of those regulators are now saying, all right, we need to sort of change our approach and open up the market to telcos.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, Nigeria's their banking system's interesting in that, like NIBS, their interbank settlement system is in some ways more advanced than a lot of the developed world. And like the Federal Reserve is they just announced their own platform to do like interbanking settlements. And so in some ways, Nigeria, the banks kind of developed a little bit quicker than we did over here. But
yeah, I mean, but it's kind of like, if you think about it, it's kind of the later you are to the game, the more it makes sense to build things a little differently, right? Mm. So when Nigeria got access to basically digital services like ATMs and digital transfers, it made sense for a regulator to be stood up that basically is the major the sole settlement system for all financial transactions, and that's NIBS, right?
Right.
Interbank settlement system. And so one way or the other, anyone who's doing digital financial services plugs into NIBS as the main switch. And that essentially created interoperability across financial services, right? So now you can move money from any bank account to any bank account regardless of where it resides. So, I mean, it kind of made sense to do it that way. It seemed pretty obvious. But yeah. I think in other countries where you had just large incumbents and heavily regulated, institutions, things kind of happen in more of a piecewise way. And, that oftentimes slows the adoption of technology.
Right. And what about like all of these trends and privacy? Like, do you think that the average African like cares about privacy to the same extent as we do in the West? I mean, I feel like here in the U.S. we've become pretty indifferent and numb towards hackings because they just they happen so much. like the Capital One hack that happened. It was in the news for maybe a couple days and then kind of went out because it just happens all the time. And I think that blockchain can sort of flip the script when it comes to privacy and certainly ownership of data, right? But do you think that the average African even cares or is kind of privy to kind of the issues surrounding that stuff?
No, right? Because I think people are more interested in just, fulfilling the basic needs, right? Food, shelter, and clothing. The majority of Africans are still, trying to solve for those basic needs. And so when you start talking about privacy, it's like, give me an extra dollar so I can have an extra meal. It's not,
right.
But it's still, I don't think it doesn't mean that privacy isn't important and isn't an issue. And I think, a lot of African regulators also think about that, right? They think about people's privacy, and I don't necessarily know that they're putting as much funding into it, or they're putting as much thought into it, but it is a concern. And I think that's a big issue that, even we at Decred really are thinking about quite a bit, because ultimately you have to have the ability to secure your wealth and maintain your privacy. And, constitutionally in the U.S., privacy is really important. So I think even though we're seeing a lot of privacy breaches and lapses, they come, at huge cost to these institutions, right? Facebook, got slapped with a $5 billion fine.
Yeah.
Capital One's probably going to get a fine, right? And I mean, some people could say, well, that's the cost of doing business. That's a risk. But I think, I think the average person or average American is thinking more and more about privacy, especially with what's happened with, like I said, with Facebook, and people not realizing how much of their privacy they were giving away, right? Not really understanding what came in the fine print. And I think people are beginning to understand more how private information is being monetized, right? If you think about, how most big tech firms in the U.S. make money, it's based on your private information and the ability to sell that information or get insights from that information that is valuable, and so, data and information is the new oil, as people say, right? And so I think people are becoming more conscious of that. And I think it's going to become more and more of an issue we hear a lot more about.
Yeah, I read an article a couple days ago about a guy who went into Facebook's setting and printed out his history of data, or you can look at all the data that Facebook actually owns on you. Mm-hmm. And I think that, it came out to bigger than this stack of books right here of just all the data that Facebook has collected on this guy, over the course of his usage of it. And, when it comes to Libra and Facebook's kind of introduction of our currency, it certainly makes sense why they would do that, considering the distribution that they own, right? And that is kind of the game, especially in Africa. If you have the distribution, there's so much monetary and financial products that you can launch on the back end of that. And WhatsApp and Facebook, when you combine the two, they certainly do own distribution in Africa. But do you think that Libra is going to be a good thing for Africa, or how do you think that plays out once it's live?
No, I think Libra is terrible for Africa. Right. So I think in the short term, so you can look at it from a surface level, right? If Libra is now accessible and proliferates around Africa, for example, it gives people access to a currency that is indexed to the dollar, whatever that basket is going to be. And it gives people on the street access to a more secure form of, store of wealth. Because most African currencies are, highly inflationary, and, based on economic cycles, they lose a lot of value, primarily because most African economies are commodity-based, right? And so when you go into recession, the price of oil, the price of copper, the price of cobalt, the price of, grains goes down. And if that's where most of your income as a country is coming from, then, you're going to feel it, and you're going to feel it hard. And so if the average person now has access to a better store of value, or access to some sort of dollar-denominated sort of value, then you can preserve your wealth. So on the surface, for the consumer, right, if everyone is kind of thinking of themselves as like, this individual actor, it sounds like a really good thing. And it also solves the problem of allowing, Africans access to markets that are still pretty hard to access today, right? So the average African has problems paying for things globally. If you're originating a transaction out of Nigeria, oftentimes it's blacklisted. It's like, okay, where is this coming from? We're not sure, right? And so in some ways, on the surface, it sounds good, but I think in the long term, if you make the assumption that most people are rational and most people are going to store value in Libra, and because it allows them to have a better store and also gives them access to be able to pay for things, pay for iTunes, pay for even basic things they use and products, then, you'll see a big migration of people who will be dumping their local currencies for Libra, like I would.
Right.
But what that does is it pulls the rug, from under the regulators, right? The central banks. Like, how does that affect your ability to leverage monetary policy if your currency basically has lost? You lose monetary policy making power. So I don't think any rational central bank, in a third world country or in Africa is going. I mean, they should literally be saying, no, we're going to block it, because it makes no sense for them as a sovereign entity to effectively allow another currency to just basically take over their markets.
Yeah. I mean, do you think they're even kind of aware of the threat that it poses? Because it seems like Facebook is going to launch it very close to, if not right when the next recession actually kicks in, and that the currency is deflating or inflating at a time when Libra officially launches and becomes certainly one of the best store values for the average African.
I mean, but I don't know. So I don't think anything is set in stone. I think there's still lots of hoops that Libra has and the Calibra Association would have to jump through.
Yeah,
and it's not quite clear yet if it's going to make it in its current form past U.S. regulators. Now, I do think it's actually in the best interest of U.S. regulators to back it, because while it removes the power of regulators in country, right, so across Africa, that power that's taken away from African central banks now actually moves towards the Fed, right? Because you effectively have, a pseudo version of the dollar, that from a company that's going to be heavily regulated if it goes through. And it actually gives, I think, the U.S. government a lot more power to influence and, leverage its economic might to effectively control other countries. So I think you're going to see, I think the resistance is going to come first from Europe. European countries are going to kind of say, all right, what does this mean? And then I think you'll see a lot of resistance from, certainly China is not going to allow it. That's definitely not going to happen. Yeah. I don't think it's going to happen in India either. And so I think what will happen is if those countries mount, what I believe would be, I think China is pretty much a given. But if India basically says, no, it's not going to happen here, and I think a lot of African countries would take their cues from that. Saying, well, if the Indians are saying this is not good enough for them, then maybe we should thinking twice about it. But I think it's a really bold move for Facebook to set this thing up. And I think it's almost like the last grasp of the incumbent tech ecosystem to remain relevant.
Right. Wow, that's an interesting comment. Well, I do think that Europe for sure has shown that they have no issue with pushing back against some of the U.S. tech giants. I mean, they have not necessarily been that too nice to Google with some of the fines that the EU has been slapping on them. And it seems like right now in Africa, the battle of internet and 5G is certainly being won by Huawei. I don't think there's any argument against Huawei kind of being currently one of the winners in implementing ICT infrastructure in a lot of African countries. And so we'll see how, if Facebook does kind of allow the U.S. to exert its geopolitical might on some of these countries, it's going to be interesting to see how China responds, potentially through Huawei or WeChat, because I know that WeChat doesn't have in itself a lot of traction in Africa, but with the infrastructure of the internet, or maybe it does. I'm not aware if it does. but I know that I guess Flutterwave just announced their partnership with Alibaba. So that certainly, certainly seems like China's making their move when it comes to, the ICT wars in Africa. But one thing that does introduce is the issue of governance moving forward and kind of maintaining stability in a world where, the recession hits, Facebook launches, they can't use their monetary policy in the same effective way that they have in the past. How can blockchain platforms like Decred help with good governance and stability and transparency?
So, I think it could do a great deal, right? And so when you think about, I think the base level problem you're solving for is, I as an individual, African or wherever it might be, I want to be able to store my hard-earned income or value in something that's relatively stable, right? And if you can provide access to Africans to Bitcoin, to Decred, to some store of value that they think is relatively reliable, I have full control over it, no sovereign entity can sort of go after my coins, right? You're solving for lots of problems and potential issues. I can move it across the world in terms of, across borders, which is a challenge for lots of Africans in terms of cost. Bitcoin is heavily used as a medium of exchange across Africa. I read a statistic that, 8% of the volume of Bitcoin transactions are in Nigeria alone.
In the world?
Yeah, globally.
Wow.
I'm not sure. I'm trying to remember where that source was. But I don't think that's ridiculous to think about because, Nigeria is a very large economy. Nigeria is heavily dependent on imports and trading, and it's expensive, right, to transact. And so if you can leverage Bitcoin, which gives you access to basically transact in places that you don't even have access today, let alone talking about cost, then the rational thing to do would be to do that, right, to leverage it. So I think Bitcoin is heavily used as a medium of exchange in Nigeria for all sorts of global transactions. So I think that, so that's the first thing. It's all right, the base idea of having this store of value I can use in exchange. But beyond that, at Decred, we're very heavily focused on governance, right? So we think about governance in terms of how the blockchain and the network is governed, and making sure that the transparent system that's pretty clear to everyone on what it means to participate, how you participate, and how you can be involved in decision making, right? And our view is that, we're trying to capture, the broad intellect of the network to make the best decisions, right? In many ways, in a very democratic way, and very transparent. And as much as possible, trying to remove middlemen in decision making, right? So it's not a representative system. There's no, middlemen who you now defer to who make your decisions for you. As much as possible, like the individual, who's the individual stakeholder, gets a say and a way to vote their minds. And I think that's really important. And I think it's important in the African context because, across Africa, there's a massive governance issue. Most of Africa, I think now is democratic, but they're very young democracies. Most are, less than 15, 20 years old. And, we still have a really big challenge in terms of not just how the governments are governed, but across society, even if you look at corporate entities, look at companies, right? I think overall, there's a massive governance issue, right, in terms of just controls and transparency. And I think that blockchain platforms can go a long way to increasing transparency, right? Anywhere from voting to, how decisions are made on a corporate level, so think about a corporation that has employees, has shareholders who, have certain powers and vote on decisions, right? There's no reason why you can't employ blockchain systems to ensure that, these individuals are empowered to make, to vote, and you can audit that, it was transparent and it was clear. So I think, blockchain systems can go a long way to ensuring free and fair elections, free and fair decision making, and transparency of how decisions are made. And I think if we can I think that's one of the big challenges across Africa where, there's a lack of transparency into many things, and that just increases the costs of everything, even just transactions costs. We don't have good identity systems. So like, who am I dealing with as a counterparty? How can I verify that they are who they are? How can I verify that, they have money in the bank and the value's there, right? And so, anything that can bring transparency into systems, I think, makes it clear where the value is and reduces costs. And if you can reduce costs, then investment will come in.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that, with blockchain, it just depends on how it's implemented and who the implementing parties are. And as long as it's implemented with the right framework, it certainly can go a long way to solve a lot of those problems. Certainly moving value around the continent. I think that's use case number one, or at least it should be in terms of implementation. But next bull run, what's your prediction? When's the next crypto bull market happening? It's been a while.
So I don't know. I don't. So I kind of feel like it's not going to be like what it was in the past. I don't think we're gonna. Right. So it's like in investments, everyone says the past is not a good predictor of the future. I'm not sure we're going to have this massive bull run like we had in 2017 ever again, right? I think, right? So I think there were some unique things that happened at the time that created that bull run, right? And some of it was the fact that a lot of people were running unregistered ICOs, right? Basically selling unregistered securities. And they could do that because there's a mechanism to do that, right? You could create a smart contract in Ethereum. You could buy ETH. You can, raise money on Ether. And if you think, in my view, like a big part of the inflation of the price of Bitcoin and Ethereum in the last run was people now seeing this as an opportunity to basically, raise funding for all sorts of things. A good number of them were scams, but even those that were not scams, like legit entities, they're very, very high risk. It's like investing in startups, right? And there was just a lot of money, and people went after that money.
Right.
And so I think post, 2017 and getting to the bear market, a lot of sovereign entities have clamped down on that. The U.S. has clamped down heavily on ICOs and registered securities. Have gone after like the most blatant frauds, and they've basically said that game is done, right? So that's one. I think that.
But that, in a sense, that's a good thing, right? Because it forces the market to become more mature.
It does. And I think it sort of removes this idea that, the blockchain space is for criminals and people who are just looking to grab money.
Right.
Which I think is a narrative that a lot of, fudsters have been pushing. But, so I think that's a good thing. And I think it will allow the legitimate projects that are actually doing things the right way a chance to sort of rise to the top. So, I think that lots of these projects that got funded during the last cycle are just going to have like a slow bleed and a slow death. Yeah. And I think you're already seeing that with a lot of, Bitcoin has, tripled this year. I think the low was like 2,800. Now it's like 10,000 and change. But we haven't seen like a lot of the alts like moving accordingly. There have been a handful of alts that have done really well, but the vast majority have not recovered, quote unquote. And I don't think most of them are going to, because I don't think most of them are going to be successful. So I think taking that away, you're taking a huge, the demand that existed for ICOs has shrunk considerably. And that's taken away this huge use case effectively that ran for a couple of years away. I think that, institutions are coming in because they see Bitcoin and some cryptocurrencies as a non-correlated asset to securities markets. And, it's gotten some legitimacy because, Bitcoin has worked for over 10 years. Yeah. And it still works and it still functions. And so we're seeing institutions beginning to come in, it started with some hedge funds who are high risk, but now we're seeing very legitimate institutions like Fidelity, TD Ameritrade, folks who want to like now issue and sell Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. So I think that, we're going to see this sort of steady rise in my view. I don't necessarily think it's going to be this massive, crazy run, maybe, but I think it's going to be more of a steady rise of continued adoption. I think Bitcoin's price will grow. I think price of projects that are legitimate and doing interesting things will also grow as well.
Well, you heard it here first. Akin Sawyerr, Africa lead at Decred. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.